Hi everyone, my name is Ishaa Vinod Chopra. I go by the pronouns she, her. I am currently in my last year of a bachelor's in early childhood education from George Brown College, and I have just recently completed an internship with Dr. W.J Davies, and I'm very happy that they were willing to speak with me on such pertinent topics on advocacy and mental health. And recently, I've also authored a book titled Finding Order and Disorder, which speaks on my lived experiences with bipolar disorder. And I also view myself as a mental health advocate and a firm believer in therapeutic dance. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Adam Davies. I am assistant professor at the University of Guelph. I use they, them pronouns. I'm also Ontario certified teacher, a registered early childhood educator, and I do a lot of advocacy and activist work in both early childhood education and outside of it. A lot of my work is around gender, sexuality, mental health, disability.
Hello, Professor Davies. Thank you so much for meeting to speak about mental health and early childhood educators. We're here today to talk about the statement that was issued by AECEO, which was supported by AECEO and authored by yourself, Brooke Richardson, Michelle Jones, and supported by the Board of Directors and staff of AECEO. The statement's title is At the Intersection of Safety, Ethics, Mental Health, and Wellbeing, Disrupting the Status Quo Regulatory Approach in Ontario. So could you please shed some light on why this statement was issued?
So we originally put the statement forward to start a conversation around sanism, meaning the discrimination against people who have been either diagnosed with a mental illness or mental health disability, or even those who might be perceived to be mentally ill or to have mental health disabilities in some way. And the intention on top of that was also to address the way in which the College of Early Childhood Educators is asking folks to disclose their mental health or physical disabilities. So in particular, the statement was about question number 6 on the annual renewal form, which asks educators to essentially disclose if they have a disability, whether mental health or physical, that could in some way impede their ability to practice safely in the profession. And so we really wish to address the way that this approach actually harms educators themselves through the very unclear and vague way in which this question is asked, and the way in which educators who are already marginalized in many different ways. Often educators are low socioeconomic status, racialized women in many cases who experience many different forms of societal marginalization. And so then to on top of that ask them to disclose if they have a mental health disability just felt really wrong and invasive on our opinion. And so we put the statement forward to start a conversation about why this is harmful.
There were 2 issues that were addressed. First was the question number 6. Could you please shed some light on the second issue, which was People Connect?
So our, I guess, provocation around the People Connect was the issues with asking people to fulfill questionnaires to self-diagnose or to diagnose through electronic means, and the way in which this connects to ideas around surveillance. So like in general right now in society, there's a big mental health crisis. Like a lot of folks are experiencing mental health disabilities and struggles. And in particular, again, given the like marginalized status of early childhood educators and the intensity of the work, that rate of burnout and mental health disability is quite high. And so then, to ask educators to go on a questionnaire and fill it out and then receive some sort of unofficial diagnosis through a self-assessment just felt really, again, invasive to us and wrong. And a really not substantial way to support people's mental health, because if they're already feeling distressed and unwell, and then they go online and fill out a questionnaire and have the questionnaire, tell them a diagnosis, then this, in our opinion, could cause more harm, and it also could cause more pathologization, because we know that there's stigma attached to diagnostic categories as well. So there's just a lot to tease apart and unpack, but it feels hollow. So
sure. So when I first learned of this question, I did not firstly know it existed until I filled the form, and then it came to me as a big surprise. And I guess my question here is, I did find out later on that once you do disclose that you have a mental health condition, then you have to be supervised while you're at work. Could you shed some light on that aspect as well?
Yeah, so essentially, if you disclose that you have, and the question also asks about disabilities widely, so the wording in the question, again, is quite vague. It includes physical and mental health disabilities. But if you disclose that you have a disability, my understanding of the process is that you then are essentially watched to a higher degree. And so you essentially are watched in your workplace as well. Your workplace, like you said, might supervise that person to a higher degree. But then the College of Early Childhood Educators is also obviously aware, right? So then you're marked kind of in a way. So that means that with that knowledge that the college has, there can be more close eye on you in your professional practice.
Do you feel that this is in any way perhaps going against what the Ontario Humans Code has set out for people who have mental health conditions?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so of course I think people who are lawyers will have different opinions, and the legal technicalities of this is something that I think is in a lot of professions. So for example, I think social work, teaching, a lot of the nursing, a lot of the helping professions have these kinds of questions in their registration forms. So that's not to excuse it, but what I'm trying to say is I think it's something that is in various professions.
Right.
But to go to your question, again, I'm not a lawyer, but in my opinion, and my understanding of the Ontario Human Rights Code, it does explicitly protect people who have mental health disabilities, and it also protects their right to privacy as well too. So meaning that you shouldn't necessarily have to disclose if you have a disability, unless you're going through an accommodation process, and even then you don't have to say the exact disability that you have. You provide your essentially your functional impairments, your limitations, and how, and then your workplace receives that and figures out how to work with that and accommodate you as an employee. But the workplace does not have the right to the actual diagnostic category that you have or your diagnosis. Now, with question 6 on the renewal form, they don't actually ask what the disability is. They do ask just if you have one that impacts your ability to practice safely. So again, given that I'm not a lawyer, I can only hypothesize that maybe that's a way around kind of things, but I'm not sure. But it definitely, I think, deserves some legal analysis from someone who is a lawyer or knows the legalities behind this, because it certainly, I think, contradicts my understanding of the Human Rights Code.
Coming from a place of having lived experiences in mental health, I have had often experiences where I do speak to psychiatrists, and I have posed this question to them, and they often told me that you do not need to disclose, or you don't need to tell anything to any employers unless and until a doctor somehow feels that you may not be well to work. So is there anything that you would like to comment on that aspect?
Well, I think really at the end of the day, again, my understanding as someone who's not a lawyer is that you don't, again, like you said, you don't have to disclose your disability, right? So another example that I can give is with the accommodations process for working. If you're asking for an accommodation at your workplace, you don't have to tell your employer what the actual category, the diagnostic category is. You don't have to say what the name of your disability is, or if it's physical or mental, you don't actually have to give a categorization. You just have to say these are my, or your medical professional says these are my limitations, and they fill that out, and then your employer works with that. And so, you don't actually have to disclose any, again, diagnostic categorization directly.
So in this statement, you have answered the question of what can be done to better support ECEs with mental and physical health needs. And I think this is definitely more pertinent because I feel that also along with you, what is being done is actually counterproductive. So perhaps what can be done to support educators who face mental health on a daily basis instead of discriminating them and providing that, like stigmatizing them. And
so I think another thing that we tried to get across with the statement we wrote was the way in which this whole issue is framed through a risk framework. So, for example, question number 6, the reason on a legal side of things, I think, again, this is from someone who's not a lawyer, my assumption or hypothesis maybe about why question 6 is there is because it's about a legal protection for the public. Because at the end of the day, the College of Early Childhood Educators is technically more about protecting the public than necessarily advocating for early childhood educators themselves. And so that's why this, again, is framed under a risk framework, because it's about the potential of what could happen, or if, say, an educator who has a mental health disability is practicing, there's this idea that they could harm someone, right? And so that risk idea is kind of, I think, a lot of what frames these kinds of questions, because they're trying to legally protect themselves. And so obviously, like you said, this actually worsens often the mental health of those who already do struggle with mental health disabilities, and it kind of makes them feel more surveilled and more scrutinized. And so it's not necessarily a caring approach or a nurturing approach for people who are already struggling. So I think an alternative to this approach that is asking people to disclose is providing caring conditions for people to flourish in their workplace. So, as I mentioned, we know burnout in particular is a huge issue in the sector, and not only just in the sector, but also I think a lot of people stop working on the floor because they're burnt out, so they move into management and higher education. And so what this means is that for people who are on the grounds in childcare settings, it's very intense, and it's really exhausting, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that the conditions are not there for
They're
people.
not conducive for. Yeah, I get it. So to add to what you said, me having been on the floor as an early childhood educator and also someone with lived experience in mental health, I often witness people also going through mental health challenges because of these challenges such as burnout and exhaustion that you mentioned. So it's actually like a double-edged sword, because you have people who are also diagnosed, but then you have people who are facing mental health challenges who may or may not be diagnosed.
But this is exactly why I think something that people need to know is that sanism, and I think sometimes when I say that word, people
could you maybe define it?
Yeah,
for someone
so sanism, again, it's the discrimination against anyone who might be diagnosed with a mental health disability, but also against people in general who are perceived to have mental health challenges or struggles. And this is, so when I say the word sanism, sometimes people don't know what I mean, because mental health is still a hush-hush kind of topic. People don't know that word as well. But sanism is really connected to ableism as well, because it's about these kind of hierarchies of how capable we are expected to be as people. And so if you're not performing yourself the way that's expected, then you're seen as kind of mentally ill or potentially unwell in some way. So sanism affects everyone. And that's something going with what you just said. So sure, and not just sure, but it does affect people with diagnoses who have specific mental health needs. but everyone also has mental health needs, and a lot of people go through intense mental health struggles because of the working conditions that they're in. And again, if you're already like a marginalized person who is experiencing like classism, racism, different like societal systems that oppress you, you're also going to have like a higher level of distress. So I think because the field of early childhood education employs in particular so many racialized women who experience high amounts of sexism, racism, and who may or may not be recent immigrants as well too. There's a lot of layers of oppression that these people who are childcare workers experience, and then to like put on top of that the low pay that they receive and like the really stressful working conditions and burnout and exhaustion.
Yeah, I guess that's another conversation, because we're again we can see the sector where we're not being well compensated.
No.
So that just adds to all these stresses.
Yeah.
So it kind of bounces off each other.
Well, because if you can't afford your groceries, how are you supposed to feel well? If you can't pay your rent, how are you supposed to be mentally healthy?
The financial stress then comes in.
It's like it's all interwoven. And so I think like one thing I do want to just add on to it is again what I already said, that sanism affects everyone, and it's not just something that is for people who have receive a diagnosis or who like have psychiatric care or experience certain mental health disabilities. The really interesting thing is so many people in the field actually become disabled because of the conditions that they're working within, right? And so that's where this
perpetuates it. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, I know this is not directly related with this, but I've read often in some of your articles where you've quoted Goffman from 1963, if you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, so Goffman was a sociologist who talked a lot about stigma. And so the idea that certain identities experience societal stigmatization and individual stigmatization. One way to think about that is the way in which even in this current moment to be LGBTQ, if you come out in certain ways, you might experience some stigmatization of your identity, right? Like as a queer person myself, I still at times feel like I might need to like cover myself a bit or pretend that I'm not who I am because I'm afraid of that stigma coming towards me, right? Like I'm afraid of the prejudice. Stigma is highly connected to prejudice, right? And so stigma is interpersonal, but it's also like societal and structural. So stigma, like when I quote Goffman in my work, it's because, so I mean, you already know this because I write about it, but I also have mental health disabilities myself. I'm very open about it, and I've only really talked about it more like as an adult, even though I've experienced these challenges my whole life in different ways. But when you talk about that, you become marked in a way, and that marking of you is a stigmatization. So what that means is that people look down on you suddenly, or they like pity you, or they think of you as like fragile, or they think of you as incapable or less competent or less able to do things. And I think when we think of educators, the pressure of raising children, and I say that word raising because there's a lot of expectations put on educators to be responsible for the development of children. And that's all
happy faces.
Yeah, happy faces like I talk about. And it's kind of funny because I actually am like I like to think that I'm a fairly outgoing person, but sometimes that's authentic, and then sometimes that's because I think that's like how I should be, right? So to go to the stigma, when you're an educator, if you're not happy all the time, then suddenly people think there's something wrong with you. So then the idea is like, what's wrong with this person? Like, why is this person not happy? Like, this person is upset or sad. And then if you're sad, then they think that you might be a bad educator, or that you might not like help the development of the children, or all these things. And so stigmatization happens between people. So like in a workplace, for example, if you're at your workplace and you're open that you have certain mental health challenges and you're asking for accommodations or you're sharing with your colleagues because you want them to understand you better or something, they might look down on you or like look at you funny, or they might even report you to like a supervisor or whatever.
Yeah.
And so that is an interpersonal like stigmatization, because
Yeah,
it happens.
I think I have experiences
Yeah.
where suddenly you're working in a place for more than a year and suddenly you get a notice which just says you gotta leave. And
Yeah,
you're like,
so that's like but that's also structural too, stigmatization, because it's about the systems that marginalize people who
yeah.
have differences in their mental health needs and whatnot. So stigma is something that can be between like one person to another,
Right.
but it can also be like a structural
So it's like
issue.
systemic and systematic, all of it together.
Yeah.
I would like to reiterate the question number 6, which is included in the statement that was issued. It states, do you have a physical or mental condition or disorder that affects your ability to practice the profession safely? Please only answer yes if you have never disclosed this information to the college, or if you have already disclosed it and this information has substantially changed since you did so.
Yeah, so in terms of my perspective on that,
Yes.
so as I mentioned, the idea of safely is something that's not really well defined in the statement. It's very broad and it's really vague. And I think what that means is for educators who are reading that statement, there's probably an uncertainty about whether or not they may or may not fit within that category. Even the idea of safety and unsafety, it's not really a simple binary. It's not something that I think people can just categorize. And in terms of mental wellness, people often might be dealing with stressors and mental wellness or unwellness at many different times in their practice. It's about the ways that they are able to navigate that, the tools that they have, and the supports that they have in place. But when the question is worded like that, there's the underlying unsaid assumption that someone who might have a mental health condition or a physical condition might not be able to practice in a way that is deemed safe. So there's an assumption that it's kind of a stable thing, when in reality, we all, in terms of our mental health, like vacillate in different ways. So it's really hard to say whether someone is able to practice safely or unsafely, because that isn't always even a consistent thing. And many people who have mental health disabilities are quite adept at navigating their everyday life despite the disabilities that they might experience. But again, it's not defined in the statement in terms of what they mean when they're asking that question. So it leaves the educator to fill in the gaps, and that's unfair and unclear.
Coming from perspective of an educator, OCT, and as well as a professor, what is a possible recommendation if you were to share with the College of Early Childhood Educators of Ontario? What could you want to share with them if you which I believe you all did do in the statement as well, but.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, and again, I've written about this, so I'm fine sharing it. Like, I have OCD, and I've experienced it all throughout my life, except I didn't really start getting, I guess, like medical treatment for it until I was an adult, even though like as a child, I had symptoms and ways of expressing it that I just didn't have an intervention for, and stigma and all these things come into it. But as an adult, like, I'm very adept at managing it and navigating it, and I'm very aware of like just, my way of being in the world and what I need and how to support myself. And so, like, I think when we have questions like this question number 6, what it does is it perpetuates the idea that if someone has a certain disability, or if people struggle with their mental health in any ways that might be read as being mentally unwell or ill in some way, like, this statement perpetuates the assumption that they're incapable and that they're unable to do their job. So my message to the college, I mean, I think one thing I would say is that firstly, so many people in our society experience mental health disabilities. So this kind of statement others people in a way that affects a significant portion of the population because of how widespread mental health like diagnoses and disabilities are. And I would also say to the college that we shouldn't assume that just because someone has a disability that they're unable to do their job or that they're going to be unsafe in some way. And if that is the assumption that we're entering into professional practice with, that's inherently sanist and discriminatory towards many people. And it also then will reinforce for people who do experience mental health challenges the idea that they're unable to work or that they are incapable. And so then there's a form of self-stigma going on with that as well too. And so, you know, if the college is a governing body that we look to as a profession to help lead us in practice, my hope would be that the college would be on the forefront of these conversations around mental health and would want to support educators who experience mental health differences and disabilities, and would want educators who have certain needs to feel like they belong and that they are welcomed and that like they can still be involved part of their workplace. But this statement and message is the opposite of that.
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor Adam.
Yeah, thank you.
For someone who has not heard of math studies before as a subject of study, you could explain that and how your research fits into that. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah. So math studies is connected to critical disability studies as well, in the sense that math studies is a way of rethinking what we call mental health. So, for example, when we talk about mental health, it's often through very medical terms.
Medical model.
The medical model. And so what it means is that it sees the individual as a problem that needs to be fixed,
right,
and that disability or mental health is something within the person, and that it is a problem within the person. And so MAD Studies asks question about how can we actually reorient ourselves away from thinking about mental differences as a medical phenomenon, and how can we talk about madness instead. And when we talk about madness, we mean more about rethinking what we call mental health. So again, instead of seeing mental health as a mental illness, and instead of seeing it as something that needs to be like diagnosed by a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist is seen as the most powerful authority, and then again, instead of seeing it as something that's a problem like within the person that the person needs to manage, MAD Studies says like, what can madness offer us in terms of creativity, in terms of inquiry, in terms of challenging norms, and in terms of thinking differently about society. So a typical approach to mental health would say, you know, your mental health might be low and therefore you might need to go see a psychiatrist, and then the psychiatrist might diagnose you with something, and then therefore you receive medication and intervention and you manage it. Whereas a MAD Studies approach would say, what is this process say about how we treat certain people as problems that need to be managed and fixed somehow.
And just to comment on that, this has been happening for generations in our society, where people who have these problems have been just put away. So moving on, I wanted to ask you about how math studies correlates with the idea of early childhood and education, and how it fits into the developmentalism, and how that is kind of pushed into the curriculum, and how that limits our perspectives on learning and inquiry.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I noticed that there was nothing in early childhood education that was thinking with MAD Studies. So when I started writing my articles, as you probably know, a lot of my work is autobiographical and yes, self-reflections. And I noticed that there was just nothing in early childhood education that talked about MAD Studies or madness. And so for me, I think that is a huge gap, and that's what my work is trying to fill, because I think that there's so much in terms of early childhood education that is based around these ideas of ages and stages, and this idea of like normative mental functioning.
Right.
So I want to unpack that because it's like a lot to
absolutely,
say about that. Developmentalism is the idea that these child development theories, in particular theories of people like Jean Piaget, Erik Erikson, Lev Vygotsky, and other kind of male 20th century like child theorists are like they're seen as the most important knowledge for future educators to know. And so developmentalism basically is the notion that these theories of ages and stages are the most important theories and knowledge for people who work with children to know, and that it is the only way to know children and education. So developmentalism is not just like the theories themselves, although the theories
excluding the rest.
The theories are part of it, but it's also the exclusion of any other ways of thinking about children. And so in early childhood education, I often hear about this idea of like shaping young minds, shaping minds, like the idea that like the importance of being an educator is to mold and shape the developing cognition and mind and brain of like the young children. And that is something that justifies the work of the early childhood educator. And so why I think MAD studies is a really critical intervention is because MAD studies is about disrupting the idea that there's a normative way that mental functioning should be. Like the idea that there's a normative brain and that there's a certain kind of form of it, like self-expression and cognition and like all that. Like MAD studies comes in and actually critiques that.
I remember what you had said once about expression and inquiry, about how children express themselves. Sometimes some are more outgoing and others are more withdrawn, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's something abnormal or wrong about their developmental patterns. So could you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so firstly, I think, you know, this isn't to say that people shouldn't receive support if they need support. Like, you know, early intervention sometimes can be a very important part of someone's life. But at the same token, I think we become as a sector and field so obsessed with this idea that we have to find out if something is wrong with a child that becomes like the main focus of our professional practice. And so why that's problematic is because we might be seeing things as like pathological when there's like nothing going on. It's just, so for example, like the idea that children are supposed to be pro-social and happy and like always interacting with their peers, and that there's these markers for kind of normative social development can be really harmful and really not culturally contextual. Can really like position children who are shy as like that there's something wrong with them. And position children who maybe are not as verbally communicative as though like that there's something wrong with them.
And that actually put them at a disadvantage as they grow up.
And I think sometimes we need to take a step back and say, maybe this child is just shy. Like maybe this child, you know, needs some time and space before they're ready to grow and be whoever they are going to be. And like, that doesn't mean that there's something that needs to be intervened into or that there is something wrong with this child. This child just might be whoever they are, right?
Exactly.
And that doesn't mean, again, that there's something wrong. And the thing is that these diagnostic categories that we put on children at a really young age are not neutral either. Like they come from a certain knowledge base as well that is built in the medical model. We label children who are really young with these diagnoses. And again, like I said, this isn't to like say that children don't need support or that everything about early intervention is bad, but it's to say that we should take a step back sometimes and reflect. But I think this idea that we're molding and shaping brains
Yeah.
becomes a real centerpiece of the justification for early childhood education.
Sure. I would like to share a statement in one of your articles, which goes like, in Davies' writing, math studies is introduced as a methodological framework to be used in post-secondary early childhood education, ECEC education, to encourage students to challenge developmentalism, disrupt normalcy, and enhance critical thinking and curiosity. And I feel that this statement spoke to me a lot and summarizes what you did speak to. But if there was anything else you wanted to add to it.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been I've been a really curious person. And so I think it's my curiosity that's led me to my current thinking. And I think we need to let students be curious as well too. And so part of curiosity is the ability to actually decide whether or not something you're learning feels good for you. Like for students, especially students who are in early childhood education, these theorists like, again, Piaget, Vygotsky, like the way in which documents like elect like early learning for every child today and all these things are incorporated into courses and woven makes them seem like that they're like capital T truth. And what I mean by that is it means that they look like that they're like unquestionable, so they seem like that you can't critique this.
It's like a Bible for...
It is.
I get
It's like
that.
a Bible for development.
Yeah.
And so I think what MAD Studies offers is, and other critical theories too, is an avenue to actually give students tools to look at what they're learning and say, hey, does this like feel good for me? Do I agree with this theory that I'm learning? Hey, like when I'm learning about this, and it seems really rigid, do I actually want to use this like ages and stages approach? Like, does this resonate in practice? Because I feel like a lot of educators, when I talk to them, they say that like in professional practice, ages and stages isn't actually really what they think with when they're on the floor. Like it actually, there's a lot more diversity in development and a lot more like differentiation. So I think like giving students the tools to be critical and curious and allowing them to actually question what they learn is a really important thing, and they should be able to question.
And actually acting out in reality that statement which says children are curious, capable, and competent.
Yeah,
but
and educators are curious, capable, and competent too, and so educators should be able to question.
Yes. I also wanted to hear your feelings about culturally relevant pedagogies.
So I mean, I think, again, if I go back to like those big names that are often taught, like Jean Piaget, like Vygotsky, Erikson, Kohlberg, all these people, they are like all white, male, kind of Euro-Western folks. Like there's not folks from the global south that are included in there. And so for me, and especially thinking about the fact that like everything, you know, in my upbringing was entrenched in whiteness and Eurocentricity as well too. There's a lot of unlearning that I'm on a lifelong, like a lifelong journey of. And so when I think about development, I'm curious. I'm like, who are the scholars in the global south who have been talking about development? Like, who are the developmental psychologists in the 20th century who are Black, who are African American, who are Caribbean, who've been theorizing development, like who are the big theorists who are not in the Western kind of canon?
Someone who speaks to me is Gloria Ladson-Billings. Really like her work with culture, and I actually, that kind of made me question a lot about why aren't we looking at the education through a cultural point of view? Because we think about it, and we live in Canada, we have people coming from so many backgrounds.
Yeah.
So,
and I think one thing just to add on to it about the culturally relevant pedagogy piece is when you think about development, it's often thought of as universal. So again, like if you look at ELECT, the way ELECT is oriented is that there's the indicators of development, and then they're broken by like the developmental domains, and there's the markers, and you can then match the marker with the indicator for the specific age.
But they're not sensitive to the children from all.
Well, I think, yeah, so what I was going to add on to is that it paints a picture that it's universal. So for the person who's reading it, they think all children, all places in the world, all contexts grow like this.
Yeah.
And that's obviously not the case.
Yeah.
And even in a Canadian context, children come from families of all backgrounds and shapes and makeups, and like development is not linear and it's not just rigid. And so when you're working with children in your care, all those children are going to develop differently as well too. And so like to have this notion that they should be exhibiting these indicators at this specific age puts forward the notion that then that's like a goal that children should perform. And those markers are also written in a Canadian context, which is not necessarily relevant for all children, especially maybe newcomer families and yeah, etc. So
my next question leads me to ask you about how you explored your curiosities, and for me that was when I read some of your poems, and they really spoke to me because there was a time when I was hospitalized and I used to write poetry, and at that time I did not know there was a term such as mad poetry, but after reading your research I also identified that as mad, and I was very excited reading your work. And I guess my question was, how did you come to expressing yourself through this form, and how did you then decide to include it within your research as a means of expression?
Yeah, so I've always written like for myself throughout my life, and as a kid I was very quiet. I was like one of those kids that like the teachers on my report card would always say like I was a very well-behaved student, so to speak, even though I was like really dysregulated inside. So I had a lot of like feelings, and I was struggling to like pay attention to things, and I had a lot going on, but I didn't show it. So writing became a way that I would express myself.
Right.
So I always wrote poems, and like sometimes the poems would be very vastly like different than the way that I would appear on the outside. So on the outside I would look very like, I don't want to say regulated because again I still struggled, but I maybe looked quiet. But on the inside I was dealing with a lot of stuff. So my poetry would be a lot more expressive, is what I mean, than how I looked on the outside. I remember as a kid, like I used to write poems in class and then draw around the poems as well too. And like some of the kids would see it and think I was really weird, or like I would get made fun of because I would look out there maybe, or you know, these types of things. But for me, that was just how I expressed myself. But I never did anything with the poems because, again, I think I learned through maybe bullying and what have you, that like I shouldn't express these emotions. And even as an adult, like I always felt that way sometimes too, like that, you know, maybe I shouldn't let that side of me show, I guess. But when I encountered mad poetry, I started realizing that these feelings that I was dealing with are like actually not quite abnormal, and there's something that a lot of people wrestle with.
Not
and
just
feel.
your story, but there's a lot of
So there's a lot of people that struggle with this stuff, but it's just that we feel like we're not supposed to like express these experiences or emotions. And especially like as a child and young adult who went through a lot of like trauma and just difficult experiences, I didn't have an avenue to explore that or to express it. You know, I like went through a lot around like my gender and sexuality as well too. I never really like I was bullied a lot in school around that, and again, like I didn't have a modality. I mean, and we'll probably talk about this a bit, but I had music, but that was the only thing.
Yeah, but we're gonna come to that.
Yeah, I had a few breakdowns in my life, essentially as an adult, and experiences where I couldn't be that ideal person anymore. Like I couldn't be that perfectly like regulated and always easy to get along with. Like I just felt like I felt broken, to be honest, and that's kind of when I came into this.
Was it essentially the pressures of normality that the society was force-feeding you with, if I may say?
Yeah, and I think what happened for me is that I felt really honestly uncomfortable in early childhood education as well, if I'm honest, because I felt like I wasn't
constantly being judged.
I felt like I wasn't that educator that you were supposed to be. Like I felt like I was like not always happy. I wasn't always put together. Like I just, these markers that were supposed to be of whoever this educator is, I just felt like I wasn't. And so I eventually broke. And then when I started picking myself up again, I started saying, you know, these poems that I've been writing, like, you know, this is a way of expressing myself, and these feelings aren't weird or abnormal. Like, a lot of people feel this way, and it's quite healing for me to put them out there into the world. And I think that's probably also a way of me coming to realize that it's okay to not be that perfect educator. Like, it's okay to not be that put together, always happy, kind of regulated person.
I guess it's like that idea of being comfortable with the uncomfortable, which most people are not comfortable with.
And I think I just realized, like, I can't be that, whatever that person is, that image that we're supposed to be, like, I can't do it. And I would much rather put my imperfections out into the world. Like, not that they're imperfections, but just put them out. And
they're perceived as imperfections, but that is who you are. But then again, you don't want to pretend and be someone else. Because that would be going against your values.
And I'd rather let other people know that it's okay if they struggle with stuff too. And it's okay for them to feel like that this mold, and I really do think this mold is in our sector, and it's connected to child development, and it's connected to this idea that children are these brains that we're molding, and that we have to, like, do these perfect things and be these perfect people to make their brains be these things. And I think it's all connected. And I was like, I'm going to put my stuff out in the world, and I hope that people feel something with it. And you know, and that's for me a way of accepting my imperfections. That's a way of me saying, like, I'm good, like, this is part of who I am, and I hope other people feel something.
I was reminded of the school I attended in India. It was called Sahyadri School, which is run by J. Krishnamurti Foundation. He was a philosopher, Indian philosopher. And we did not have any tests or exams. It was very open-ended. The whole experience was open-ended. And when I think back to that, I think about how even now, like, although we say that, oh, you know, be curious, do what you want to, but still our curriculum seems so rigid in a way that they have to end up doing things in a certain way, so that does not leave them with any room for their imagination or exploration. And I feel like they're also very pressured to make the educator happy. You know, I don't know if that is there, but I've seen that where they want that validation.
I think, so what that brings up for me is that in my experience, like, working with children, before becoming an academic or whatever I am, I always felt like I needed to be, like, the most energetic, like, happy, effervescent person in front of the class, and I felt like this need to perform. And I think I can think of a lot of different situations working with kids where that worked for me, because it got the kids' attention and they engaged with me, and I got feedback that was, like, positive. Like, people would say, like, you're so good with kids, you're so great with children, you know, you bring a positive energy, and that stuff's not bad, like, that's all great. But the problem in that is that some of that was forced, it wasn't authentic. Right? Because I felt like that was what I had to do.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you also feel that somewhere it's a false presentation? Because these children come here, and then for a few hours they're here with these educators who are putting on these happy faces, and then they go home, and possibly the parents or the family members or the caregivers also have their own stresses, and obviously they cannot be putting on happy faces 100% of the time. So I'm sure it must be confusing the children at some level.
I think part of it is because, like, if you're an educator with young children, the professional expectation is often that is your persona. And this is where I think the emotional labor piece comes in, because you get paid. So you're paid to be an educator who works with children, and then the unwritten expectation of receiving that pay is that you perform. And I think there's a lack of authenticity in that, and what it also does is it denies the children real conversations around the variety of emotions that people experience. I think, like, so children need to know that people can be unhappy at times, but that doesn't mean they're unhappy with the child. Like a child doesn't necessarily have someone who, you know, is able to walk them through that or talk to them about that, but it's an important skill. Yet, like, and I think we all in life struggle with that. I know I do too. We all personalize things, but
like
I
talking
think,
about emotions in the curriculum as well. Like, how do you feel? And
it's okay if so-and-so is upset today, and that doesn't mean so-and-so doesn't like you or is upset with you. So-and-so might be having a hard day. Like, so whoever your teacher is might have just lost a parent or family member and might be struggling to show up at work that day. And that is a really difficult thing and probably would affect someone's demeanor and how they're able to do their job. And so if that teacher is less happy or is more subdued, that doesn't mean that they're upset with the children in their class or their care. Like if they show up to work in a childcare setting and they're not doing songs and games the same way that they usually do, or they're feeling down or they're just slightly more reserved, like they might have had a big loss recently, or they might have had some personal struggles that are really affecting them and weighing them down, or and that doesn't mean that they don't like the children around them or the educators around them, but how do we create like space to actually talk to children about that and to say, like, for you, child, like, or children around me, like, I still love you whether you're happy or not. Like, I still care for you whether you're happy or not. So you don't need to pretend. Like, you can be sad, like, your feelings are valid. But I think, like, happiness is treated like a commodity. And so when you're paid to do your work, part of the expected labor is the emotional labor behind it.
So I wanted to share an experience I had back in India when I was teaching in a boarding school. I guess I was having one of my bad days and I did not put an eyeliner or a kajal. So one child came up to me and she was like, "Oh, what is it? You've not put this. Is everything okay?" So I guess that in that moment I felt that I was being myself. At the same time, the child was supporting me, I was supporting the child. So it was that honest interaction. So I totally understand that, and I do feel that I feel challenged to experience that sometimes in the working environments here because of the high expectation that...
I think there's a judgment. Not to cut you off, but I think there's a judgment, and I think like it's that interpersonal stigma. Because what happens is that if you show up and you're not able to fill that role on that day, or you're showing up and you're more subdued, or you're struggling in a specific way, I think in our sector in particular, when you talk to people about that, there is this interpersonal stigmatization that goes on. And I actually see a lot of that having to do with the fact that it disrupts the idea of the early years as happy, because we construct early childhood as these innocent, happy times. And so when you're a teacher or an educator and you're working with really young children, you're supposed to maintain that innocence. You're supposed to maintain that sense that this is the happy years.
But do you believe, like, I'm sorry. Do you believe, like, if a child, for example, the concept of risky play and everything, but do you believe if they go through more experiences like that, that actually inevitably makes them stronger as they grow older?
Yeah, I think it's, I guess my balanced approach to that, so to speak, I don't like the word balanced, but you know what I mean, is that no one should have to go through trauma. Like, I think this idea that we grow through what we go through might be true, but that doesn't mean that, like, trauma is a good thing, that, like, people should have hard times. But I certainly think that if you're able to, sometimes you can take something from that and grow. Not all the time. Sometimes bad things just happen and they're just bad things. But you know,
but I guess like problem solving.
And you can take something from it and grow. I think children who encounter different kinds of emotional expressions and caregivers who are different ways of expressing themselves are then able to have more nuanced perspectives on emotion and understand that people can love them in different ways, and that it's okay for someone to love them and care for them but have a bad day. Or it's okay, like I talked about this with my partner because we love each other, but sometimes we still fight or argue. And you know, everyone does when they're in a relationship. You still have arguments sometimes. And those arguments sometimes you say things without thinking, or you're not always the kindest person to your partner. But you still love them immensely. And there's this ongoing understanding that even if you're frustrated with the person in the moment and say something not so kind, you still love them regardless.
Yeah,
And
it comes from a place of love, actually, because if you didn't care that much, you wouldn't be so emotionally involved in it.
yeah, and again, this isn't to justify being unkind. And I think that your relationship with your partner is different than your relationship with a child that you're caring for. And, no one should be yelling at kids.
Yeah.
But my argument around this stuff is essentially that, it's okay to be someone who cares for children, but to not necessarily fill that happy role. That's my argument. It's okay to be a teacher and an educator, but to not always be smiley. Should we still always be kind and respectful to children? Absolutely. Should we be self-reflective and not unkind? Obviously, of course. And we don't have to be happy all the time, And that's real, and when we talk to kids about that, they can learn as well, too.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. My next question leads us to expressing ourselves creatively. I know for me it has been through dance therapy, doing Kathak and Latin forms, and I recently found out that you have a bachelor in music.
I do.
Can talk about that and how you got into it. And
so I started playing music at a young age, and it was always something I was drawn to. So I started playing piano first.
Okay.
And I think like many kids, I was signed up for piano lessons, and I enjoyed it, but again, many kids at a young age, it's one of kind of the activities that some parents might sign their kids up for. Like some people do sports, other things. And so I really clung on to it right away, though, and very quickly realized that even if I felt unsafe expressing myself in other places, music was something that I could. And especially as someone who was a little shyer as a kid, this isn't to say that I was always reserved, but I like to play video games. I read a lot. I was kind of like an individual, I kept to myself a little bit.
Yeah.
So music became
solitary play.
I was more solitary play, yeah. I had friends, but honestly, okay, I'll tell a fun story quickly. So my friends would go knock on my door, and they'd say, "Is Adam home?" And I'd be in the basement, and then I'd look up the stairs to see that they were at the door, and then I'd run back to the basement and pretend no one was home because I didn't want to go outside and play. I just wanted to be at home. And so I'd just pretend that no one was home, so they'd knock at the door and ring the doorbell, and then no one would that's so bad. Anyways, it's fine. You can use that too. I'm looking at the camera right now. And I'm sorry if my friends ever see this from childhood. I still like to, because I lived on a court and I just didn't want to play all the time. Sometimes I wanted to watch TV. I wanted to honestly, I loved watching Sailor Moon, and I just wanted to be in my basement watching Sailor Moon and reading and playing Pokemon and I was very individual. So anyway, so I wasn't always the most social, but music became a way that I could kind of express myself. So I started signing up for recitals and stuff too, and then I actually started singing. So I joined the choir at school, and I was the only boy in the choir, and so some people did make fun of me for that, but I didn't care. I was like, you can go away now. I'm singing. I'm in the choir. So stop making fun of me. You're a poo head. I don't need your negativity. And so I was singing, and then I started having people tell me that I was actually good at music. So my choir director, I don't know if this is because again I was the only boy or whatever, I don't know, but she, I eventually got all these music awards in elementary school and stuff, and she told me, she's like, no, actually you're a really good singer. I started playing piano at recitals, and so it became an avenue to kind of, I don't know, I guess get some validation, because I didn't ask for validation a lot in my day-to-day life. But then I encountered in middle school the saxophone, and honestly, I'm trying to remember how I even landed. I think I just was oh, that's a big kind of gold-looking instrument that looks fun. I'm gonna play that. I don't even remember what thought went into it. I think I actually had to play the clarinet for a year, if I remember. I think they didn't let us start with the saxophone, so I think I actually did the clarinet for a year. And then I was over it. I was like, no, I want the saxophone.
Yeah.
and then I started it, and it just became this thing that I worked really hard at. Like, again, as someone that was really like solitary, I just was like I just fell in love with it, and I was like, I want to be like the best saxophone player. So I started working and practicing like all the time, and then I wanted to go to an arts high school because there was an arts high school in the area, but it was like an audition one, so I couldn't just, you know, sign up and go. And I told my parents, I was like, no, I don't want to go to that like local school. I want to go to the arts high school. So they were like, okay. So they signed me up for like lessons with like, you know, someone really professional, and my parents have been always very supportive of music, and so I worked really hard and practiced a lot, and then I went and I did my audition and I got in. So I got into the arts high school and I did that, and then I realized like more and more like, even though I was in the background in other areas of my life, like again, like I was kind of quiet in class, like I didn't really, like I was good at school, but I wasn't like an A+++ student. And I did struggle with, as I've mentioned, like attention kind of stuff sometimes, but music became an outlet. And so I started getting a lot of like, I don't know, opportunities. And then I joined all the bands in my arts high school. So when I went to the school, I did like the stage band, the musical pit band, the like jazz band, the wind ensemble. And I realized it was like what I loved. And what I realized about what I loved, to connect it back to madness and like expression and stuff, is that it became a way for me to really emote and really express myself. And so in particular, I started focusing on classical saxophone, which is something a lot of people do not know about, because when they think of the saxophone, they think of it as jazz.
Right.
Like they always think of it as like that more brassy kind of like harsh sound. But the classical saxophone is really like sweet. It's smooth. It's like, it's just, and I just fell in love with it. And I was like, I want to play like arias. I want to play sonatas. I want to like be on stage and have like an orchestra behind me. Like I want all that stuff. Like I just want to do it like, and honestly it gives me goosebumps talking about it, because it just like was such a big passion for mine. And even if the rest of my life was like really hard to navigate, music became really important, and I really love playing sad music. And so I really fell in love with arias in particular, because I loved the idea that even if I didn't think I could be sad in other places in my life, I could be sad when I performed an aria, and I could do something that was like really haunting and kind of melancholic. And so one of my music teachers at near the end of high school was like, you know, you really have a gift, and so if you're serious about this, you might want to think about auditioning to university for music. And so I told my parents, I was like, I want to go to university for music. And then they're like, okay. And like, you know, again, I'm very privileged that way, because they've been supportive. And so I went and did all the auditions at the different schools, and I got in. And
You went to Wilfrid Laurier,
I went to Wilfrid Laurier in Waterloo. And to go back to madness, my undergrad degree was like actually a really difficult time for me. It was something that was there was a lot of just, I was dealing with a lot of emotional like dysregulation. That's like more when I got like more of my diagnoses and stuff for mental health conditions, and I like that's when I had more like kind of psychiatric, I guess, like interventions and stuff. And I was trying to make sense of feelings and emotions I didn't really know how to make sense of fully. And I also came out as gay in that time, and I think that was really challenging for myself and a lot of people in my life in different ways. Like I grew up religious, and so that came into things too. So anyways, this is just, it was tumultuous. It was like not an easy time. And so when I was playing music and performing, it became like similar to what you talked about with dance therapy. It became like a real therapeutic avenue for me.
Like for me, I mean, I wanted to share what I go through. Like when I dance, like all my thoughts come to a stop, and I'm just in that moment with that music and in that movement. And so I'm at peace then, you know, and I was wanting to relate it to maybe what you go through. What are your thought processes when you're playing that music? What kind of frame of mind are you in? And I know you said you want to experience that melancholy in that imaginative world, and how that feels, and not necessarily having it to relate to the real life and what you're going through, which I find very fascinating. But what is it that you go through, you know, when you're playing that instrument and you're in that moment?
So one of my favorite pieces to play, which is in the recording that I sent you, it's just called Aria for saxophone. and it's by Eugene Bozza, who is a composer, classical composer. They're very simple arias, and he's written them for a lot of different instruments. But what I love about his aria for saxophone is that it's very melancholic. It's very sad. It's very haunting, and it also doesn't really resolve itself. Like, even at the end of the piece, there's a bit left that's like still there, kind of. It's not fully closed. And so my process behind like performing is that there are certain emotions and feelings that I think we are just not able to fully experience in our day-to-day life. And part of that is because we block ourselves off from experiencing those things. And then I think the added layer is that when you're an educator, especially someone who works with young children,
to further suppress it.
There's even more pressures. Like, you just have to shut it down. Not that you have to, but we're told to. And so when I'm performing, like, for example, the aria by Bozza, it can take me to a place that I'm not able to fully emotionally encounter in my day-to-day life. And I think that there's something about the cadences in the piece and the dynamics and just like the sadness in the melody that allows me to almost put myself into a state that I, again, have to stop myself from getting to when I'm just navigating my day-to-day life. Because if I let myself get to that sad place, like, I would be crying for like all day. And as, you know, someone that's trying to work and live and navigate, you know, society, I can't often let myself, even as someone that does this mad work, like, I can't let myself get there. And so, but for 3.5 minutes, like, I can let myself touch that.
And that brings me also to a question which I didn't really plan, but how do you detach yourself also from your work by not getting, maybe, I don't want to use the word trigger, but getting emotionally, you know? Because I know I did have this experience where I was up at 4 in the morning and I was reading an article, and I had tears rolling down my face. So I have to say that it's not something that is, that experience in itself was, it was powerful. It was powerful work that you had written, and it touched my heart. And I'm sure it affects so many people out there. But the question again for you is, how do you, I mean, are you consciously making that boundary, or so that you can function and so that you can go on and write the rest of your work? And how do I navigate that? Yeah, how do you?
I think it's a yes and no. Okay. So, like, to your question about if I'm conscious. Some days it's like a lot easier to do, and then some days I think it's really, really hard. Because, so like Mad Studies, this work, like, I came at it, like, I think I mentioned, like, I came at it from a place of feeling broken. Like, I came at it from a breakdown.
But it has been a healing and catharsis for you.
So, but I came at it from a place, I think, of needing something else besides development and statistics and feeling like...
Because it was restrictive for you.
I just felt like what I had to offer was not what the field wanted or the sector, and I think when you feel so alone, it's hard. And then when I found Mad Studies and Mad Poetry, I was like, oh, this is like more me, and then I can put this out there and make other people feel alone, or not feel alone, hopefully not alone. But I think the boundary and the compartmentalization happens some days better than other days, and I think that that's something I have to consciously do.
Right.
Because, like, part of why I'm doing this work is authenticity, right? Like, I've mentioned.
Yes, and that won't take place if you're not able to connect with the work and have those yes days.
But then at the same token, as I mentioned with the music, I have to still navigate work, life, everything. And so I can't fully let myself sometimes access those emotions. And so I think, like, when I'm writing the poetry, that's a time when I let myself not be compartmentalized. Like, when I'm writing the poetry, I kind of let it all flood out in a way.
Yeah, like you don't stop
I'm not
yourself.
even
You don't stop
thinking.
that.
It's
Yeah.
not even like it's not even like a conscious process sometimes. I'm just like, I let something flow and it goes, but then I have to stop it again, right? So you
Yeah.
have to cut it off. And so I think, to go back to the question about the compartmentalization, it's something that is hard, and I think it's also involves, to some degrees, I'm still putting on different faces in different places, right?
Yeah,
Like the
I get
mad,
it. It's a different role that you're playing.
the mad poetry is like one version of me, but then I have to be the version of me that's still, I don't know, I don't want to say is not mad, but I still have to contain it a bit, right?
I guess you express differently and kind of, I get what, I do understand
Yeah.
what you're saying. I had a request if you would like to recite some
Sure.
of like a whole of your poetry or some parts of it. I
Sure.
especially like this one. It's up to
Yeah.
you. If this is,
I would-
I think, one of your most recent works.
Yeah, okay. This one is called A Refusal to Get Over Depression. So I wrote this one about my experiences with depression, and like kind of saying things that I felt like I, on a day-to-day basis, couldn't say.
Right.
So I guess part of this is making sense of some of like the thought processes that like as a child were going through my head as I was experiencing like you know, kind of being closed off, I guess. And then another part of this is also exploring, which I'm starting to do in some of my other work, exploring the ways in which I coped with depression as well, or
Yeah.
like created different worlds. So one of my favorite video games is called The Sims, which many
Right.
people probably know about. And it's the like life simulator game. So it came out when I was probably like 8 or 9. And immediately, like I clung to it right away because I was like, I can make like my own reality. Like that's so cool. Like if I don't like what's going on in my reality, I can make my own. And I would use like the cheats and make myself super rich and have like the fanciest clothes and like the fanciest mansion house. And I remember I'd go tell my dad, I'd be like, Dad, I'm gonna live in that house someday. And he'd be like, okay, good luck, buddy. But like, you know, I think when I felt alone in my own life in a way, I could make my own like reality. And it was
Sure.
also a way of like making almost like a fantastical imaginary reality, because The Sims did so many funny things. Like they had like ghosts and like random robbers that would come into your house, and like it was just like the most nonsensical random game in the world that like people would come in and out all the time and you didn't know how to make sense of it, and I loved that. So I think it became like an imaginary like fantasy world for me. So anyways, to make a long story short, I kind of started writing about that. So yeah, sure, I can perform the poem. So this is a refusal to get over depression. So hiding is not the same for everyone. Some hide by running away. Others hide by running into a book, a video game, a world, other than the one that we exist within. The book that is always under my desk is a key to a world where I can be and become other than the here and now. Sometimes I feel everything. Sometimes I feel nothing. Does anyone else ever feel this way? Depression is funny because it is like a compression of the soul, one that can be so very distressing. Depression, compression, distressing. Yet depression can be freeing. There can be freedom in being sad. They called me sensitive because I felt things others couldn't or wouldn't feel. Instead, I learned to cross me out. I learned to survive by staying quiet. Shh. Molding myself into whatever version is socially acceptable. So tired, 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 tired. Am I good? Are we good? Am I good enough for this image? Ideal goal criteria, checking the boxes of who and what an educator should be and become. Am I good? Am I a good educator? I just want to be myself. I kept and keep asking, am I good? Because I genuinely wanted and still want to know if I am good. My favorite part of the day is when I play The Sims, an old video game where I could create a world different from my own. It was my escape. Playing this game, it is like revisiting when I was 8, like an old friend, a blanket, a world. It was my world. The Sims was my escape. Creating people's stories, narratives, a life in The Sims, spent recovering a green energy bar where life is as easy as clicking on a bed and going to sleep. In The Sims, being tired is a temporary state, not a way of living. But in real life, I'm always tired, so tired until it feels like who I am is tired. Smiling, 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 there's nothing underneath the smile. These theories have no names to describe me that are kind. Post-secondary education is like a club. I knew I had snuck in. I wasn't expected. I wasn't supposed to be here. They didn't know who I was when they let me in. They told me not to feel so much, so I felt nothing. They told me not to feel nothing, so I felt everything. They told me not to be so mad, so I made madness my identity. You sit, I sit, we sit and learn how to work with children like me. But I'm still here, still mad. Thanks.
It's beautiful. That was the one that made me cry second time, and I could also relate a lot with.
Yeah.
I guess the last one that I wanted to ask you about is extending into the work that you do and your advocacy regarding a bill. I had not planned to ask this question, but I ran into a recent article that you had co-authored, and the title is As Campus Protests Escalate Surrounding the Israel-Gaza War, Ontario's Bill 166 is not the answer. If you could please speak to this and the advocacy through your writing that you have done in support of educators and professors and academics who have lived experiences in mental health, and how you may speak to that.
Yeah, so when I wrote that article for the conversation, or I co-authored it with my colleague Zara, what we were speaking to was the fear that Bill 166, which was put forward around campus mental health initiatives and also anti-racism initiatives in colleges and universities. While that seems obviously like really good in many ways and important, what the bill actually does is it gives the authority of the government in many ways to intervene into the functioning of colleges and universities. So what that means is that issues around like academic freedom, so that means like the ability to have freedom to engage with thinking and inquiry that means something to you without censorship, could be put at risk. And so really my concern when I wrote that article with my colleague was around the fear that the government would have more authority potentially to intervene and regulate colleges and universities under the guise of promoting like mental health and anti-racism initiatives. And so what that means around like the work that I do with MAD Studies is that, as you probably know, this work it does receive pushback. So like many people don't think that this work should be out there. We mention it in the article around the regulation of early childhood education, but what happens for college programs and also university programs that are early childhood education degrees is that they are all approved through the Ontario College of ECE, and then also using criteria set by the Ministry of Colleges and Universities.
Yeah.
So what that means is that there's a lot of layers of regulation on them.
Yeah.
And so
that leaves little room for
inquiry.
Yeah.
And so like the fear is essentially that with these layers of regulation and even more layers of regulation that could take place, areas of inquiry that might seem like radical or that might get pushback, such as MAD studies, could be even more censored. So like the fear really becomes that the work we do,
freedom of speech.
Yeah. And so in particular, the university context, colleges are a bit different because most colleges are really regulated and monitored by the ministry.
Okay.
And so they have to go through a lot of approval processes through the ministry. But universities, even though they are publicly funded mostly, are still typically seen as places of freedom of speech. Like universities and university campuses are typically seen as places where people can have freedom to inquire different topics and to have their own thoughts and opinions. And so with an increase in regulation on that, the fear becomes that it will clamp down on critical inquiry.
And I just wanted to mention that you co-authored this article by Zura Abawi?
Yeah, exactly.
Zura Abawi, yes, I'd like to acknowledge that.
And, So, I mean, our fear is that it will become harder to do this work. And MAD studies, no one was doing this before I started writing this article, in the sense that I didn't see any early childhood education work that was using MAD studies as a theoretical framework. And when I started to do this work, like there is a lot of pushback, and the reason for that is because, well, firstly because of how heavily developmentalism is like hung on to, but also the layers of regulation. So it becomes really hard to do anything that is outside of child development in the early childhood education post-secondary level, because of how also like these programs get regulated, and then child development seen as like the most important.
Now when you talk about developmentalism, I was going to bring this up earlier, but you also have a very interesting article about how exploring sexuality with children who have disabilities is not explored in Ontario schools as much. Would you like to speak on that?
Yeah, I mean, so that's another part of my work. So I do a lot of this MAD studies, advocacy, and writing work, but I also am really passionate as well about sex education. So that's a big that's a big part of my research area as well. And I do a lot of advocacy around better sex ed in schools because, frankly, the school system does not do a good job. And so, in particular, like children with disabilities are often especially left behind in the conversation because people don't think of disability as something that could be or should be connected with sexuality and gender. And so children and youth with disabilities are often not imagined as having a sexuality or a gender identity, and people don't imagine them as often having a future in terms of potentially having romantic or sexual relations and partners. So there's a level that they get desexualized. And so, you know, another part of my work is really challenging those assumptions and hopefully advocating to make more inclusive sex ed in our school systems and outside of our school systems. But I'm a teacher, so I do talk about the school.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for meeting with us today, Professor Davies. I realized that you have done so many articles and so much work, and just by printing just these many, I got about 100 pages. And it was, I mean, and it's not just about the sheer like quantity, it's also about the quality. It's very rare when you come across work that is both rich in quality and quantity, and I want to thank you for your contribution to early childhood sector and other sectors for mental health especially. I mean, that's because I relate with that, and also different identities, because for me to identify as someone who has lived experiences in mental health and also introducing the concept of Sanism to our literature. I want to thank you for that, and also meeting again with me today. And It's been it's been overwhelming, enlightening, and your presence is inspirational. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
The union of art and academics is really visible in your work.
Thank you. That honestly means so much to me. So I really appreciate everything that you've done and been doing, and your advocacy as well. And so yeah, I just enjoyed the conversation today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.